As we come to 2 Samuel chapter 23, we come to David's last written words. All his psalms were finished and in the hands of the priestly choir director. And surely it had been a little while since he completed the psalm that we just read and found in the last chapter, chapter 22. Now remember, it was then placed in the hands of the priestly choir directors, and it was placed in the book of Psalms as chapter number 18. Well, prior to chapter 22 in the psalm that we dealt with in the last lesson, David had experienced much in his reign as king. He began as the king of one tribe for 2 years. That was the tribe of Judah. It must have seemed like a trial run to see if he had it within him to be king. He became king of the whole nation of Israel in his 3rd year as king. And boy, that was from 1 tribe to 12 tribes and was a rocket ride to the top. He then faced and fought all the nations that surrounded Israel and won them with the help of the Lord, who did most of the fighting. He knew how to rely on the warrior of warriors. That's the Lord, who's the warrior of warriors. And all the nations were subdued and began paying taxes to David and to his nation. Those details cover the essence of his journey to the throne and his triumphs as king in chapters 1 through chapters number 5. But then in his 8th year, he sinned with a married woman by the name of Bathsheba, if you will remember. And that led to a sin with the death of her husband Uriah. And that led to one of David's most trusted counselors, who happened to be the grandfather of Bathsheba, who decided to lose faith in David. Ahithophel was his name. The Lord declared family troubles for David after that because of his sin with Bathsheba. And remember, the baby died. His son Amnon molested his daughter Tamar. Tamar's brother Absalom killed Amnon. Absalom ran to his grandfather's town for protection. David let him stay there and did not check on him at all. Finally, David's nephew Joab guilted David into bringing Absalom back home. But when Absalom arrived, David would not see him. And Absalom began developing a 2-year conspiracy to form a mutiny against David, to kill David and become the king. The nation of Israel was divided. Absalom had been crowned the new king by David's own tribe, which had made him king for the first 2 years. That was the tribe of Judah. What irony here. David's men defeated Absalom. Absalom was killed. David almost lost his kingship because of the way he grieved for Absalom. Joab once again stepped in and guilted David into acting like a king should act when the king was before the people, and so he did. And then there was the question of whether or not the tribes wanted David to continue to allow him to be their king. It was a mess of messes, if you will remember. Finally, David arrived in Jerusalem only to face a 3-year famine brought on by the Lord, not because of David's sin, but because of a sin that King Saul, had committed by breaking a national vow that was set in place by Joshua. David had to handle that problem by handing over 7 descendants of Saul to be put to death, handing them over to the Canaanites, who demanded them because the sin was against these Canaanites. Saul's sin was more than 40 years before this point in the storyline, but all sin has a reckoning day, as you will remember. Wow, David had really truly lived through much in his reign as king. Looking back through all of this, of how the Lord had protected David, David wrote his last words in a song, and he needed to give the Lord praise. So in this song, as we arrive here in this chapter, in which this psalm cannot be found over in the psalm books because it was never turned into a song over there for the priestly choir directors to add to the book of Psalms. But in this song here in chapter 23, verses 1 through 3a, actually verses 1 through 7 is where it is, but we're going to start here in verse 1 and go through 3a to begin with. It is a song that is telling of David's great resuscitation of his attributes, his expectations, and his acknowledgments. David is doing the right thing in this song. He is remembering the past. He's remembering what's expected of him, and he's acknowledging where those expectations are coming from and where his protection came from. The attributes were from God. The expectations were from God, but the acknowledgments were from David. First, the attributes. Chapter 23 and verse number 1. Now these are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, declares, the man who was raised on high declares, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and His word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spoke to me. Notice the compiler tells us that these were the last words of David. Now, if you keep on reading, you'll realize it's obvious that these were not the last words of David, but these are the last written words of David. But David is going to speak many things, for he's still going to be king for quite a while. And he has much to say to people like Nathan and Bathsheba and Abiathar and Solomon, as will be recorded over in 1 Kings. He also gave an order after he wrote this psalm that would cause trouble for him with the Lord, but we will look at that when we get to chapter 24. Now in these verses we find that the Lord had raised up David, had anointed David, did give David his songs, and put the words in his mouth, in David's mouth. These were the attributes of David bestowed on him from the Lord God. He had been raised high by the Lord. He had been anointed by the Lord. He had been given the sweet psalms by the Lord, and the Spirit of the Lord had spoken through him to give him direction. Well, now we come to those expectations I told you about. Verse number 3b. He who rules over men righteously, who rules in the fear of God, is as the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, when the tender grass springs out of the earth through sunshine after rain. The Lord expected David to rule men righteously, is what is going on here. He expected him to rule men godly. These two things must go together as a monarch of Israel if David was to be the ruler of God's people. How different this was from the rulers of the massive nations that surrounded Israel. Israel was always little bitty compared to all the nations that were around them. For the most part, the rulers were unrighteous, heavy-handed despots who required that the people fear and worship them as king instead of worshiping and fearing God. Now, what a fresh approach to being a ruler of the people it was for David. You know, I own property in a subdivision where we are required to be members and pay taxes to an association yearly. The association board of directors, they all must be property owners to serve a 2-year stint on the board. You cannot find a better group of property owners anywhere. They are just really a great group of folks. However, here's an interesting thing that I've noticed. As time passed, almost everybody has the opportunity to serve on the board. The board is elected at the annual meeting every year, and anyone can take their turn serving on the board for a 2-year stint. I have been amazed as I have watched how serving on the board changed people during that service. Those same folks that complained that the board was ruling unjustly over them and wanted to be on the board to change the way things were done, once on the board, they began to mimic the exact things that the previous boards were doing and ruling unjustly as they thought. When their 2-year stint was over, they went back to just being, property owners in the association. And it always takes about a year for those folks to once again turn around and start complaining about what the new board is doing, which was exactly what they were doing when they were on the board. It doesn't change. You say, what's the point here, Jim? Well, not everyone is cut out to be a board member, folks. Not everyone is cut out to be a ruler of people. Not everyone who thinks they will be righteous in ruling over people will be that when they have their chance in those positions, sitting in those seats. And as such, when the unready step into power, they change because they're not ready for power. The result is that you have the rulers up there and the peasants down there, and there's no middle ground. Such is how it was with the kingdoms around Israel. Up there and down there, the rulers and the peasants. But with David, his kingdom was to be different from all those other nations. The difference was breathtaking, in fact. It was like rising from your bed in the early morning to see the light of the new wonderful day, filled with the smell of the freshness of spring, with the view of the new growth and the possibilities, and the feel of the sunshine after a morning rain. That was every day in David's kingdom. That was expected of him in his rule of Israel by the Lord. For all of those attributes and all of those expectations from the Lord, David was pondering and David was thinking, and we come to the acknowledgments of David that the Lord put in place an order of things and contrasted them with the worthless things. And thus the title of our lesson today, Put Things in Order. Put your business in order. First, the order of things, verse number 5. David saying, "Truly is not my house so with God, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me, ordered in all things and secured. For all my salvation and all my desire, will he not indeed make it grow?" When David wrote this psalm, he could rightly conclude that his house was ordered in all things. He could conclude that his home was secure. He placed his newly ordered and secure Israel in the hands of the Lord, and that was his place. He could even say his salvation and his desire for his family and Israel were ordered and were secure. Then rightly he could ask the question, will he, that's the Lord, not indeed make it grow? Well, why not? The Lord had made it grow under David for years. Why not in the years to come? If David stayed righteous and godly, why not? Oh, but David also had to ponder the worthless things. Verse number 6. But the worthless, every one of them will be thrust away like thorns, because they cannot be taken in hand. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they will be completely burned with fire in their place. Do you remember back in verse number 2 of this chapter where David said, "The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and His word was on my tongue"? He said that on purpose. Take that to heart. It is the Spirit of the Lord causing David to write this warning about worthless things, worthless people. Worthless things bring trouble, confusion, conflict, cruelty, and much hurt to many people. I'm sure every one of you can think back in your life about people in organizations that you've been part of that you could give the connotation that they were worthless. Remember, this word worthless means evil. These are evil things. These are evil people. When worthlessness comes, when evilness comes, it is like being stuck with a giant thorn that cannot and should not be touched by anyone, but it is thrust into the flesh. He goes on to talk about the spear and the iron, that tools must be required to get through these thorns, this worthlessness and this evil, even if they're spears, even if they're javelins, if they're the chariots and the war horses. And we're talking about war here. You have to go in and cut them out without touching them. You have to take care of the worthless and the evil. You have to cut them down, pile them up, and burn them. Get them out of your organization. Get them out of Israel. These are all man's actions. For when a king is righteous and godly, the thorns do not come like this. When you're being led by anointed ones, things are wonderful. Things are godly. But when you're being ruled by the worthless and by the evil, things are not the same. Folks, we can compare this to churches today because many of us have been part of churches because of our age in this class, how long we've lived and been Christians in the church. We've maybe been in several different churches, and we know what it's like to go through a church that's being led by evil and worthless men. A church should be a place of safety, a place to heal, a place where you find comfort the moment you walk in the door, a place you experience the peace of the Lord. But when you arrive at church and none of these attributes are present, you do not feel safe. Your spirit is disturbed instead of healed. You enter the building comforted as you walk in, but you leave the building distressed. You expected peace, but you only found conflict. It is time to find a new place to worship, folks. A new place to worship the Lord. Why? Because your leaders have made terrible mistakes. They're evil and they're worthless. And those mistakes have hurt many people, and maybe even you. You will notice the blame game beginning to occur also. The pointing of the fingers by these worthless and evil people. Those in power will point the fingers and tell their version of the truth about where they think the problem began, but they will not point the finger at themselves where the problem actually began. If Absalom had won his mutiny against David, the nation of Israel would have never survived the change. The conflict as Absalom caused such disruption in Israel, and it would have continued and fostered all that conflict into the nation, a nation led by Absalom. David was the Lord's anointed king, folks. Absalom was not. Thou shalt not touch the Lord's anointed is really the main theme throughout 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And the problem is Absalom had dared to touch the Lord's anointed, and David was the anointed, but Absalom was not. When the unanointed begin to touch the anointed, things go wrong. When wrong people are calling the shots, the rest of the people will be hurt. But even the anointed will make wrong decisions and hurt the people. But with that, the Lord always directs them and turns them about. David could not know that this song has ended here with a prophecy for him from the Lord. He is going to make a worthless decision. He was about to make a disastrous decision that would bring great harm and thorns to the people. He did not know that he was giving a prophecy here. He would have to seek the Lord and make another choice, which is what people should do. But he would not like any of the options that the Lord would give him to remedy his sin that has brought penalty to all the people of Israel. We will see that story play out in chapter 24. Now for the rest of chapter 23, The compiler summarizes 37 men who once served David's great battalion. The compiler was giving honor to the men who stood by David on the battlefields for all of his reign. However, the first grouping of the mighty three whom David trusts comes, and these three are mentioned here. The first mentioned was a man by the name of Adino in verse number 8. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Josheb-Beshebeth, a Tachemonite, chief of the captains. He also had a nickname. He was called Adino the Eznite because of 800 slain by him at one time. No doubt, Adino, that's his nickname, was a mighty warrior as exemplified by his killing 800 men in this passage by himself at one time. His name is new to David's list, not seen before in 1st or 2nd Samuel. And why that is where I'm not exactly sure. But it is interesting that over in 1 Chronicles, chapter 11, we find that he also killed 300 with his spear at one time. So he had killed 800, and another time he had killed 300. The second of David's mighty three was Eleazar, verse number 9. Not Eleazar the priest, but a warrior by the name of Eleazar. Verse number 9. And after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Ahohite, one of the three mighty men with David when they defied the Philistines who were gathered there to battle, and the men of Israel had withdrawn. He arose and struck the Philistines until his hand was weary and clung to the sword. And the Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to strip the slain. Now the phrase, and the men of Israel had withdrawn, along with the phrase that they returned to strip the slain, tells us exactly when Eleazar joined David to fight. It was when David killed Goliath. He was part of the army of Saul who chased the Philistines and returned to strip them all of their spoils after defeating them. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and also its parallel passage over in 1 Chronicles 11. He would have been older than David by at least 3 years. You see, men were not allowed to go into battle in Israel until they had reached the age of 20 years old. Eleazar had to be at least 20. Now we know how old David was when he killed Goliath because we know how old he was when he became king, and we also know the year of David's reign when Goliath was killed. Goliath, it's simple math, folks. Goliath was killed in the 27th year of Saul's reign, and he reigned for 13 more years until his death. So there's a 13-year deal there. Now, David becomes the king at the age of 30. So 30 minus the 13 means that David was 17 years old whenever Goliath was killed by David. Eleazar was probably more than 3 years older than David, but he was not less than 3 years older than David because he couldn't be in the army if he was less than 3 years older. He had to be at least 20. The third of the mighty three was Shammah. He too was with Saul when David destroyed Goliath, verse number 11. Now after him was Shammah, the son of Agee, a Hararite, and the Philistines were gathered into a troop where there was a plot of ground full of lentils, and the people fled from the Philistines. That's where the people were fleeing and getting away from this. This was the army fleeing that we talked about in the last with Eleazar. But he took his stand in the midst of the plot, defended it, and struck the Philistines, and the Lord brought about a great victory. Well, the plot full of lentils was the ground just behind where Goliath was standing and where the Philistines were taunting Saul and the warriors of Israel when David showed up at the age of 17. Shammah joined in the chase after David killed Goliath, and they chased those Philistines back into this field of lentils. And he too was at least 3 years older than David for the same reason that I explained with Eleazar. So this is interesting. Then the compiler comes back and gives us a word about these three mighty men, Adino, Eleazar, and Shammah. Verse number 13. Then 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came to David in the harvest time to the cave of Adullam, while the troop of the Philistines was camping in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, while the garrisons of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. David had a craving and said, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." So the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem, which was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink it, but poured it out to the Lord, and he said, "Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of the men who went in jeopardy of their lives?" Therefore he would not drink it. These things the 3 mighty men did. Well, the story tells us that these 3 mighty men had been with David long before he became king and proved themselves to David repeatedly as loyal and fierce. These 3 mighty men who were there when David killed Goliath later abandoned the army of King Saul and joined David at the cave of Adullam at the time when David was on the run from Saul in order to stay alive. If you will remember, some 600 men joined David there, and they followed their captains, and these were 3 captains that are mentioned there who were captains of Saul's army but defected and came to be with David. And they remained with David, these 600 men and these 3 captains, for the rest of David's life. The 3 mighty men who defied the odds to get water for David when he was camped at Adullam on the run from Saul were 3 mighty men who stayed with David for the rest of his reign as king of Israel. The compiler then tells us about the mighty 30 of David. He starts with Abishai, the chief of the 30, in verse number 18. Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was chief of the 30. And he swung his spear against 300 and killed them, and had a name as well as the 3. He was most honored of the 30. Therefore he became their commander. However, he did not attain to the 3. Now Abishai was one who went with David to the camp of Saul, if you remember, and took Saul's jug of water and his spear when Saul was asleep and no one was protecting him. And Saul was right in the middle of the army and no one was awake of Saul's army, and no one was awake protecting Saul, if you remember. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 6. He was the nephew of David. One of his brothers was Ashiel, who, if you remember, was killed by Abner in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 22. His other brother was Joab, the commander of David's army, who was replaced with Amasa, if you remember in our last story, only to become the commander again after he killed Amasa. Now going on, we find Benaiah. Benaiah was younger than David and came into David's life after David became the king of Judah. He was the high priest's son and could have been the high priest one day had he not killed men and an animal with paws, a lion, in his late teenage years, as recorded in this passage, verse number 20. Then Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done mighty deeds, killed the 2 sons of Ariel of Moab. He also went down and killed a lion in the middle of a pit on a snowy day. He killed an Egyptian, an impressive man, and now the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but he went down to him with a club and snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. These things Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, did, and had a name as well as the 3 mighty men. He was honored among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3, and David appointed him over his guard. By killing the 2 Moabites, the lion and the Egyptian, Benaiah had forfeited his right to be a priest of any kind in the nation of Israel. Therefore, David made him his personal bodyguard because of his mighty deeds. David's bodyguards, his unit of bodyguards, consisted of Philistines, if you remember. And when Benaniah became their commander. So David had a Jewish Israelite as the commander of his bodyguards, but his bodyguards were Philistines. Benaniah will survive David, by the way, and he will enter into the service of King Solomon when Solomon becomes king. Now moving on, the compiler offers the names of David's remaining 30 mighty men. Verse number 24. Ashel, the brother of Joab, was among the 30. Now that's very interesting. Remember Ashel. Now look on down through these names, okay? I'm not going to read through these names because I won't be able to pronounce them correctly. And they're just telling us the names of these 30. But we only have to look at the first name in this list, and the first name is Ashel. Now, I've already told you about Ashel. And we only have to look at the last name in this name, and that is the name Uriah. The first name and the last name in this list, two names that we recognize, to realize that not all of these men may have been alive at the time when David settled back in Jerusalem as the king of Israel. This is a summary of all the mighty men that had been serving in during David's reign. And the reason why I say the first and the last is because we know these names. We know these people. We know these stories. The stories are in 2 Samuel. Ashel, the nephew of David, had died at the hands of Abner in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 22. After the beginning of David's reign as king of Judah. Uriah had been killed in 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 26, at least 23 years before David returned to Jerusalem. If you remember that, Uriah was Bathsheba's husband, and David had him killed. Now those names that are in between Ashel and Uriah, we know nothing of their lives and deaths, by the way. These 30 were all just simply part of David's inner circle as he reigned through his years, with all these circle of 37 men who helped, mighty men who helped David and won. But with all life on earth, as time rolls by, they all die, including David. However, some would go on to serve under Solomon. Some of these mighty men, we'll pick up and find them in the list of the servants, the mighty warriors under Solomon. Now, we may have heard the last written words of David and a summary of David's faithful warriors throughout his reign. But what about his last mistake? What about that last mistake of David we mentioned just after his song here in this chapter? His mistake would bring harm to Israel. And opening it up to chapter 24, we hear these words. Now again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, "Go number Israel and Judah." The king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, "Go about now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and register the people, that I may know the number of the people." But Joab said to the king, "Now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still see. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the commanders of the army. So Joab and the commanders of the army went out from the presence of the king to register the people of Israel. So when they had gone about through the whole land, they came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. And Joab gave the number of the registration of the people to the king, and there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. Now in the parallel passage over in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verses 5 through 6, we hear that God was displeased with this thing, so he struck Israel. Why did it displease the Lord? How did the Lord strike Israel? What did David have to do to end the judgment of the Lord? It was David's sin that caused all of this, and it was David alone who needed to confess and to repent to stop this judgment. To do so, David would have to call upon the name of the Lord to hear the Lord's instruction on what he needed to do to remedy his sin. For this, David would need a man of God. The Lord had one ready to help David, by the way. He had been with David since the days David was on the run from King Saul. He was the prophet Gad. The Lord spoke to and through Gad regularly. All David had to do was ask. What did Gad tell David? We will find that out in our next lesson, our final lesson, in chapter 24 of 2 Samuel.